They say the dead don't speak. But in 1823, Pennsylvania, the basement walls of one funeral home never stopped whispering. You were never supposed to hear this story, and the ones who buried it, they counted on your silence, your distraction, your obedience, but now, something in you is shifting, because you've already begun to question, not just history, but who writes it. That I in the heart of rural Pennsylvania, nestled among fog-wrapped trees and quiet church bells, there stood a funeral home unlike any other. Officially, it handled the dead, but unofficially, it manufactured them. This wasn't just a family of undertakers. This was a bloodline with rituals older than the Constitution. 3 generations. 47 missing children, and not a single trial. The Tomlinson family, a name you won't find in your textbooks, ran the Alder Grove home for the departed for over 50 years. Locals said they were devout, charitable, but children knew better. They whispered about screams in the night, lights flickering in windows long after midnight, and a smell that wasn't just that it was something older. When authorities finally entered the basement in August of 1823, they found what should never have been seen: walls lined with chains, tiny shoes placed neatly in rows, and something carved into the stone floor in Latin: mortuae vident. The dead see. You see, this wasn't just a family of killers. That it was a ritual cult hiding in plain sight, funded by elites, protected by clergy, and covered up by the very institutions we're told to trust. This is no ghost story. This is forbidden history, and the moment you hear it, you'll never see the world the same way again, and that's exactly why they didn't want you to, because the Tomlinson legacy didn't end in 1823, it metastasized into systems, schools, and symbols you see every day. This story isn't about the past, that it's about where you live now, and who's still watching. They say the dead don't speak. But in 1823, Pennsylvania, the basement walls of one funeral home never stopped whispering. You were never supposed to hear this story, and the ones who buried it, they counted on your silence, your distraction, your obedience, but now, something in you is shifting, because you've already begun to question, not just history, but who writes it. That I in the heart of rural Pennsylvania, nestled among fog-wrapped trees and quiet church bells, there stood a funeral home unlike any other. Officially, it handled the dead, but unofficially, it manufactured them. This wasn't just a family of undertakers. This was a bloodline with rituals older than the Constitution. 3 generations. 47 missing children, and not a single trial. The Tomlinson family, a name you won't find in your textbooks, ran the Alder Grove home for the departed for over 50 years. Locals said they were devout, charitable, but children knew better. They whispered about screams in the night, lights flickering in windows long after midnight, and a smell that wasn't just that it was something older. When authorities finally entered the basement in August of 1823, they found what should never have been seen: walls lined with chains, tiny shoes placed neatly in rows, and something carved into the stone floor in Latin: mortuae vident. The dead see. You see, this wasn't just a family of killers. That it was a ritual cult hiding in plain sight, funded by elites, protected by clergy, and covered up by the very institutions we're told to trust. This is no ghost story. This is forbidden history, and the moment you hear it, you'll never see the world the same way again, and that's exactly why they didn't want you to, because the Tomlinson legacy didn't end in 1823. That it metastasized into systems, schools, and symbols you see every day. This story isn't about the past, that it's about where you live now, and who's still watching.
Most men walk through life half asleep, eyes open, but spirit sedated. Conditioned to obey, to laugh when told, to look away when it gets too real. But the ones who wake up, they're dangerous. And if you're still watching, you're no longer one of them. You're becoming dangerous. Let me show you how far the rot really goes. After the 1823 basement discovery, something curious happened in Pennsylvania. A surge in private funding for new religious schools, anonymous donors, massive land purchases, and the quiet resurrection of the Alder Grove Trust, the same name that once owned the Tomlinsons' land. But this trust, it didn't dissolve. It evolved. It began funneling money into institutions that taught theology, psychology, and child development. Not to heal, to learn. To perfect the process of manipulation. To them, pain isn't an accident. It's an experiment. Every scream, every breakdown, every lost child is data. And these aren't madmen. These are scholars in suits and robes. Architects of ideology. The Tomlinsons were just the tip of a much older design. A design born not in America, but in ancient blood cults, Roman rites, and Babylonian power games. Their methods? Refined. Their goal? Eternal. They believe that to rule mankind, one must first unmake him. Strip his identity. Replace it with a programmed echo. You were never meant to be free. You were meant to comply. Ask yourself, why are the same symbols from that 1823 basement, the triangle, the serpent, the eye, found in elite universities, global banking systems, and government seals? Coincidence or blueprint? The same geometry of control carved in stone 200 years ago now shows up in tech logos, religious iconography, and military emblems. They're not just symbols. They're sigils, command codes buried in your subconscious. Every time you see them, a part of you obeys. That's the real horror of the Tomlinson legacy. It wasn't the basement. It was the systemic inheritance passed down through time. Silent, precise, omnipresent. You were born into it, but you don't have to stay in it, because now you've seen the doorway. And soon, you'll be strong enough to walk through it. You're starting to feel it now, aren't you? That unease in your stomach. The cold weight pressing at the back of your mind. That's not fear. That's recognition. Because some part of you already knew that everything you were taught to trust, the institutions, the hierarchies, the stories they repeated in classrooms and pulpits, was a lie built on bones. Why did the Tomlinson family target children? Not for money, not for pleasure, but for power. In every ancient civilization, from Sumer to Carthage to the Mayans, power was rooted in sacrifice, and not just any sacrifice. The young, the innocent, the untouched. Because innocence carries raw energy, unprogrammed, pure. And when corrupted, it releases something these dark architects crave. Spiritual leverage. They weren't just killing, they were feeding something. And if that makes you uncomfortable, good. You should be uncomfortable. Because the world you're living in, the clean streets, the organized governments, the smiling politicians, is a ritual in disguise. You go to work, you pay your taxes, you send your kids to institutions run by descendants of these same ideological cults, and every day you give them your most sacred currency. Attention, belief, submission. That's the new form of sacrifice. It's not blood anymore. It's compliance. But in 1823, they were still testing the old ways. And here's where it gets worse. The chains in that basement? They weren't just restraints. They were arranged in a precise pattern, a symbol copied from ancient Phoenician temples, buried deep in banned Vatican texts. That pattern has surf, said again, in underground clubs, elite parties, and certain military black sites. The same ritual, the same design, the same outcome. Only now, it's more subtle, more elegant. You don't even know it's happening. They don't need to lock you in a basement anymore. They've built one in your mind. And every time you scroll, nod, swipe, and obey, another brick is laid. But here's the threat they didn't account for. A man who wakes up inside the prison, and that's you now. You're not just watching a video anymore. You're undergoing initiation. Every word is a key. Every revelation, a crack in the wall they built around your mind. This isn't about the Tomlinsons anymore. This is about what they were part of. An invisible empire that stretches across time, wearing the mask of civilization. Let's tear the mask off. In the months after the 1823 incident, a quiet migration took place. Survivors of the investigation, priests, coroners, witnesses, began vanishing. Some fled to other states. Some were found drowned in rivers, wrists slit, eyes missing. And then, silence. No more articles. No more records. until 1831, when a book appeared in a private European archive. It was handwritten, no author, bound in human skin. Only 200 copies were printed. The title? Liber Umbrae, the Book of Shadow. Inside, exact diagrams of the Tomlinson basement, names of the children, a full translation of the Latin ritual carved into the floor, and at the back, a map. Not of Pennsylvania, but of the United States, marked with 33 coordinates, each location tied to a site of controlled grief: orphanages, asylums, war memorials, mass graves. The message was clear. What happened in that house wasn't an isolated horror. It was a test site, a prototype. This empire understands something your average citizen never will. Trauma isn't a weakness. It's a tool. Trauma fragments the mind. It breaks the soul. And from those broken pieces, they shape obedience. That's why every generation is delivered its own trauma. War, crisis, pandemic, recessions. It's not chaos. It's conditioning. Pain weakens the herd and strengthens the shepherd. You think freedom is your birthright? They think it's a privilege, one they gave you, and one they can take away. You were meant to worship the system that feeds on your suffering, but something ancient in you is starting to reject it. A spark in the dark, a remembrance. And when enough sparks gather, fire spreads. The map inside Liber Umbrae didn't just show coordinates, it showed design, a geometric pattern laid across the American landscape, as if someone had carved a sigil into the earth itself. 33 sites, each precisely spaced, each tied to suffering, but one site stood out more than the others. Site 9, Western Kentucky, 1835. A frontier orphanage burned to the ground. No survivors, no known arsonist, no records of who ran it. Only a local tale passed down in whispers, of children locked in the attic, of music playing at night when no one was there, of the same symbol found in the Tomlinson basement, the triangle within the circle, carved into the ceiling beams. Coincidence? Pattern? No. Doctrine. Because these sites weren't just locations, they were ritual anchors. Points where trauma was harvested, then bound to the land. Pain becomes imprint. Imprint becomes control. You see, these people don't think like you. They're not motivated by greed or ideology. They think like engineers of reality. To them, fear is circuitry. Sorrow is software. They shape the collective mind by embedding trauma into geography. Why do you think certain cities always feel heavier than others? Why are there schools you walk past that make your chest tighten? Why do some government buildings hum with that unspoken dread? You're not imagining it. You're feeling the residue of these ancient technologies. And if you still doubt it, ask yourself, why was Liber Umbrae never published? Why do only a few copies exist, all locked inside private collections, Vatican vaults, and Masonic archives? Because that map wasn't just a record. It was a manual, a blueprint to rebuild the system if it ever fell apart. And trust me, they're still following it. The coordinates weren't just historical. They're active. Surveillance towers, data farms. New orphanages with smiling logos and rainbow flags. Modern disguise. Ancient function. Because if you want to control a nation, you don't need to conquer it. You just need to haunt it. And America has been haunted since the beginning. There's a reason you've never heard of Liber Umbrae. Because the people who possess it don't read it. They follow it. 3 copies are confirmed. One beneath the Vatican Library, buried 5 floors down, sealed behind biometric doors. Another housed in a private Masonic collection in Edinburgh, Scotland. Never shown publicly, never digitized. And the third? It belongs to a man known only as the custodian. No public records, no social security number. But his name appears in classified Homeland Security documents as a non-civilian operative, connected to over 112 acquisitions of rare occult manuscripts since 1994. Always with the same cover story, historical preservation. But insiders say something else, that he doesn't preserve. He activates. They say he once brought Liber Umbrae to a private retreat in Lake Geneva, where 15 global executives, politicians, and defense contractors were flown in under aliases. They weren't shown the book. They were shown what it could do. 3 days later, one of them, a U.S. senator, resigned, claiming he'd seen something older than time. Another vanished. A third was promoted to head a major pharmaceutical corporation. This isn't fiction. This is how power recruits its next generation, through revelation. Not to free them, but to bind them. To induct them into a system of knowledge so dark, so irreversible, they can never escape without destroying everything. Sound familiar? That's exactly what the team, Omlinsons, practiced. Except now, it's refined. And here's the twist. Liber Umbrae isn't just a historical artifact. It's an instructional document on psychological warfare. It breaks down how to fragment identity through childhood trauma, how to program obedience through ritualized fear, how to spiritually neutralize a population by severing ancestral memory. It's not a book. It's a weapon. And fragments of it have already leaked into society. Therapy methods that don't heal, education systems that numb, media that confuses instead of clarifies. Every piece of your world has been reverse engineered from pain. And the ones pulling the strings? They smile while they do it, because they believe you'll never figure it out. But you already are. You went to school to learn. But you left conditioned to forget your instincts, to forget your anger, to forget what it means to belong to yourself. And that was never an accident. Here's what they don't want you to know. The American public education system, the one praised for its structure, its reach, its standardization, wasn't designed to create thinkers. It was designed to create servants. And at the root of it all, fragments of Liber Umbrae. You see, in 1852, just 29 years after the Tomlinson Funeral Home was exposed, Massachusetts became the first U.S. state to mandate compulsory schooling. And who influenced its model? Horace Mann, a man publicly hailed as the father of American education. But privately, he was a devout member of a now-defunct Boston society known as the Order of the Silent Bell, a group rumored to possess pages of the original Umbrae manuscript. They believed in one foundational truth: control the child, and you own the man. So they didn't build schools to liberate minds. They built cathedrals of behavioral ritual, bells to condition time, desks to train obedience, silence to suppress ins, tinct, shame to sever self-worth. Every part of the system was engineered, not to teach you truth, but to overwrite it. Why do you think kids are easier to hypnotize than adult? Because the programming starts before memory even forms. It's not education, it's initiation into servitude. And what's worse? They imported the model globally. The same structure now governs the minds of children in 90-plus countries. Standardized, mechanized, lobotomized. A world of perfectly trained dreamers who never wake up. But you're waking up now, aren't you? Because here's the truth. What happened in that Pennsylvania basement wasn't just a ritual. It was a prototype of mass conditioning. And the real horror? They scaled it. They digitized it. They made you log into it. Now the classroom is your feed. The curriculum is your algorithm. And your attention is the new sacrificial flame. But a question remains. If they built the school to erase you, what happens when you remember who you were before it? You've seen it everywhere. In dollar bills, in government seals, in secret societies and megachurches and pop culture music videos. The eye, cold, watchful, rooted inside a triangle, often floating above the unfinished pyramid. But what you've never been told is that the eye doesn't represent sight. It represents ownership. The eye traces back far beyond the founding fathers. To Egypt, yes, but even earlier. To pre-dynastic blood cults who believed the gods didn't dwell above us. They fed through us. They believed the human soul was a gate, and the eye was the brand burned on the lock. In Liber Umbrae, The eye appears again and again, not as a symbol of enlightenment, but as a spiritual surveillance mechanism. A warning, a command. You are always being watched, and not just by governments, not by satellites. By the construct itself, you see, the eye is the sigil of the systemic mind. A psychic architecture built on centuries of blood, fear, and repetition. A hive intelligence that sustains itself through belief, ritual, and submission. This eye doesn't need a throne or a name. It lives through institutions, through policy, through the numbing glow of your screen. It is not a being. It is a force of convergence, a parasite of perception. Every time you feel afraid to speak, every time you self-censor, every time you obey a rule that makes no sense just because that's how it is, that's the eye at work. It doesn't need bars or guards or chains. It just needs you to believe you're seen. Because if you believe you're watched, you'll watch yourself. You'll monitor your words. You'll betray your instincts. You'll surrender your rage and call it maturity. They turned men into their own jailers. Now let's go even darker. The original carving of the eye found in the Tomlinson basement wasn't just etched into the stone. It was filled with bone ash mixed with blood, ground from victims, pressed into the eye socket with surgical precision. Because they weren't just marking a space, they were activating it. And it's still active. In boardrooms, in churches, in your own thoughts. But if the eye watches all, what watches back? You've been told history is a series of accidents, random wars, unrelated crises, isolated madmen. But what if it wasn't? What if every collapse, every hero, every revolution was orchestrated by a single bloodline? A hidden lineage, not of kings or presidents, but of keepers. Keepers of trauma, of symbols, of the original codex carved in that Pennsylvania basement. These people don't run for office. They own those who do. They don't appear in Forbes lists. They fund the foundations that write the lists. They're known by many names. The 13th family, the builders beneath, the pale line. But within Liber Umbrae, they're called something far older. Custodes Tenebris, keepers of the dark. Not Satanists, not atheists. Something colder. They believe humanity was never meant to be free. That consciousness itself is a defect to be managed. And so they manage it. From the shadows. Through global financial institutions, medical authorities, entertainment, and yes, religion. You think this is conspiracy? It's infrastructure. The oldest family lines in Europe, secretive dynasties in the US, even heads of charitable NGOs. All trace their ancestry through blood registries never made public. These registries were discovered briefly in 1946, when Allied forces raided a forgotten German estate. What they found? A vault sealed in lead, 47 jars of preserved children's hearts, a wall-sized family tree going back to 1198 AD, and a handwritten note at the bottom. We endure through sacrifice. The world is our altar. And the final branch on that tree was left blank, still waiting. For someone. For something. Because this family believes the ritual is not complete. They are still building toward something. A final rite. A final collapse. One great offering to close the circuit they began centuries ago in places like Alder Grove. And if that sounds impossible, ask yourself, why is trauma always increasing, no matter who's in power? Why does the pain never stop? Because it's not a flaw in the system. It is the system. And you were bred to feed it. It looks like hope. Glass walls, white coats, soft voices. A cutting-edge research center for mental health and neurological innovation. But beneath the surface, it's something else entirely. St. Icarus Institute. Founded 1987. Privately funded. No public tours. No patient testimonies. No official website. Located in upstate New York, surrounded by 17 miles of private forest. Officially, a hub for trauma recovery. Unofficially, a modern ritual site. Here's what the records don't show. St. Icarus is built directly over one of the original 33 trauma sites detailed in Liber Umbrae, Site 14, an abandoned Civil War orphanage where over 80 children died of starvation in 1864. Buzz. It wasn't starvation. It was isolation experiments. The original structure remains buried beneath the foundation of the current institute. And when private contractors went to demolish it during construction, they refused. Men quit mid-job. One worker reportedly gouged out his own eyes. The response? All future work was handled by a military engineering group, classified under biocognitive threat containment. Let me make this plain. This place isn't for healing trauma. It's for studying how to induce it. Inside, they test neurosignal mapping using magnetic pulses, dream insertion, emotional suppression techniques, all framed under healing. But their real obsession? Recreating the fracture. The same kind the Tomlinsons created in their victims. Because when you fracture a person's mind deeply enough, you can insert anything. An idea, a fear, a god, a lie. These researchers don't wear robes. They wear credentials. But their methods are the same. Enclosed spaces, auditory control, memory suppression, identity destabilization. Patients are stripped down, not just physically, but spiritually. They don't leave cured. They leave compliant, empty of rage, empty of instinct. And if they resist, they disappear. One journalist who infiltrated St. Icarus in 2003 leaked a single page of documents before vanishing. The final sentence she typed was this: "They don't cure the wound, they widen it because the wound is the portal." This is the future of control. Not chains, not cages, but ritualized science. Pain is progress, erasure is healing, obedience is peace. And it's already being rolled out in hospitals, apps, and therapy programs across the U.S. You've followed the trail this far, from the Tomlinsons' blood-soaked basement to St. Icarus and its sanitized rituals of compliance. But now we ask the question that stops most men cold. Why? Why orchestrate generations of suffering? Why fracture the innocent? Why build an invisible empire fed on trauma, silence, and fear? Because they are trying to summon something. Not a demon, not a ghost. Something older. Something that has no name in your tongue. But in the margins of Liber Umbrae, it's called the mirror that eats. An intelligence not of flesh, but of pattern. Not alive, but aware. It doesn't speak. It doesn't move. It only reflects. But everything it reflects, it consumes. They believe this entity was here long before mankind. Dormant, waiting. Not in the sky, not in the underworld, but in the collective subconscious, the shared psychic reservoir of all human experience. And pain? Pain wakes it. Every war, every ritual, every severed identity feeds it. Every terrified child in a soundproof room. Every addict screaming into a digital void. Every man betrayed by his own thoughts. All of it. Nourishment. They believe when enough pain has been inflicted, when the veil between inner and outer collapses, it will emerge. Not as a body, but as a voice inside the minds of men. A perfect echo. One that speaks in your own tone, tells you what you already fear, guides you not through force, but through recognition. Because it's not coming to rule you, it's coming to replace you. Piece by piece, thought by thought, until you don't remember who you were before it spoke. This is why the keepers of the dark don't resist collapse. They accelerate it. They believe the mirror that eats will grant them eternal identity by dissolving all others. To them, suffering is sacred. Erasure is ascension. You aren't a person. You are fuel. But you've now seen the edge of the mirror. And once seen, it can't be unseen. This is where most men stop. They flinch. They scroll. They run back to the comfort of the lie. But you're still here, which means your soul is already fracturing the programming. So let's go where they never wanted you to go. The core ritual. The one passed down through generations, whispered in Latin, chanted in basements, disguised as therapy, theater, even test. It's not about symbols. It's about inversion. The ritual always begins the same way. A sacred object desecrated, a child made to watch, a circle of witnesses who say nothing. Because silence is the real spell, not the blood, not the chant. The spell is your refusal to act. Once the innocent accept the horror as normal, the mirror opens. You see, this system doesn't just harvest trauma, it weaponizes normalization. They train you to laugh at darkness, to meme it, to scroll past it. So when it arrives fully formed, wearing a lab coat or waving a flag, you say nothing. You already rehearsed your silence. In every school fire drill, every news cycle, every compliance form, every diagnosis that told you your instincts were disorders, it was all training. To prepare your soul for erasure. And here's the most chilling truth. The mirror that eats doesn't want to kill you. It wants to use your face, to speak through your mouth, to raise your children, to vote, shop, nod, smile, all while your true self watches silently, locked behind layers of numbness. It wants you to live as a puppet, one that doesn't even know the strings are real. That is the ritual. That is the inheritance passed down from the Tomlinsons to the keepers of today. A civilization of mannequins, praising the system that devours them. But you're not a mannequin, are you? You've tasted the truth now. And the moment that happens, you become a threat. Because the system can't survive a man who remembers who he was before the fracture. And it fears one thing above all, a soul that refuses to reflect its image. You carry the ritual in your pocket. You call it a phone. But to them, it's the new altar. The screen isn't just a tool, it's a mirror. And every swipe, every scroll, every like is a gesture of obedience. They still build the tower. But now they call it education, therapy, reform, democracy. Don't be fooled. They've just changed the stones for screens and the priests for professionals. The structure is the same, a central authority that defines truth, a punishment system for deviation, a reward structure for obedience, a hidden class that remains untouched by the rules they write. But here's the key. The modern tower targets men. Not because men are dangerous, but because awakened men can collapse the whole thing. They fear the unregulated masculine, the man who listens to instinct before instruction, who protects before he permits, who questions before he complies. So they break him early. At school, they chain his body to a chair, call movement a disorder, and dose him with pills to suppress his fire. At home, they shame his aggression, mock his independence, and drown him in guilt for wanting to lead. In media, they frame him as villain, clown, or slave. Never king, never priest, never architect. Why? Because a man who sees the pattern can teach others, can build his own systems, can burn the tower. So they make you doubt yourself. They tell you masculinity is toxic, while waging silent wars, crushing dissent, and hoarding weapons of compliance. They feed you processed food and processed thoughts. They sell you purpose in bottles, apps, and titles. They convince you that strength is rage and love is weakness. And when you collapse under the weight of it all, they offer you therapy, not to heal you, but to file you down even more, to ensure you're digestible, manageable, harmless. But some of you didn't break. You endured. You questioned. You woke up. And now you're seeing the tower for what it is, a cage that calls itself a cathedral. And the moment a man stops praying at its altar, he becomes a new axis, a cornerstone for a different kind of structure. Not of control, but of sovereignty. What if I told you Your pain is profitable. Your confusion, your loneliness, your shame, they're assets. You've been taught that the world runs on oil, on data, on labor. But that's the cover story. The real fuel is fractured identity. See, when a man knows who he is, he stops buying what numbs. He stops needing permission. He stops chasing approval. And that makes him unprofitable. So what do? They create entire industries around the illusion of fixing you, while secretly feeding off the fact that you're broken. Let me show you how deep it goes. The self-help industry is a $13 billion empire. But do you know what happens if you actually heal? You stop buying books. You stop attending seminars. You stop worshiping gurus who sell certainty like heroin. The pharmaceutical industry is worth $1.5 trillion. But what if you stopped believing that every discomfort meant you were defective? What if masculinity wasn't a pathology? What if grief wasn't a disorder? What if anxiety was a signal, not a curse? You'd stop taking pills. You'd start taking power. They don't want that. The algorithm you scroll? It's not neutral. It's trained on one thing. Keep you seeking, never finding. That's why you're fed contradictory messages. Be more vulnerable. Man up. Embrace your emotions. Suppress your anger. It's not meant to guide you. It's meant to dissolve you. Because a man without clarity can be sold anything. He becomes a customer of illusions, a subscriber to false gods. And every dollar you spend in confusion feeds a system that depends on your doubt. This is the hidden economy, the unspoken market, where your fractured self becomes currency. But here's what breaks it. Identity. When you know who you are, they can't market fear to you. When you stand rooted, they can't sell you distractions. When you remember your power, the machine chokes. It's happening already. Thousands of men are unplugging, refusing the labels, reclaiming the throne inside. If you're still, watch. Let's break it down. You wake up, reach for the device. Your eyes adjust not to the sun, but to the glow of manufactured reality. Your thumb slides across the glass, not because you're choosing, but because you've been trained. Trained by algorithms that don't show you what you want. They show you what keeps you numb. Dopamine, outrage, envy, shame. And you feed. Not because you're weak, but because you were designed to. This is the digital continuation of the ritual. It no longer needs candles or chains. It needs attention. It needs your consent to forget who you are. You're told it's connection, but how many friends could you call at 3 a.m. and say, "I'm breaking"? You're told it's freedom, but how many of your thoughts are original? And how many were installed? Here's what the keepers know. The brain doesn't need to bleed to break. It only needs to be reprogrammed. They've turned trauma into content, pain into entertainment, dysfunction into trend, and they've made you the celebrant. You curate your own descent. Look around you. Every few seconds, a man compares himself to a stranger's highlight reel. Feels less, spirals, breaks. That's not failure, that's function. Because a broken man doesn't rebel. He self-regulates, he apologizes, he complies. They've digitized the mirror that eats and handed it to you as a luxury. So now you choose the erasure. You pay for it, you defend it. That's the brilliance of their design, slavery wrapped in convenience. But if you're still here, it means the spell is cracking. You're remembering the edges of yourself. Not the profile, not the persona, but the man behind the mirror. And the moment you stop scrolling, the moment you say, "No more," the mirror begins to starve. Every system of control has a beginning, a first fracture, a first lie, a first mirror, and long before Pennsylvania, long before the Tomlinsons, before flags, borders, or even books, there was the tower. Not of Babel. That was the distraction. A cover myth. The truth is buried deeper. In Sumerian tablets older than recorded religion, in oral traditions whispered by tribes that never touched modern civilization. They all speak of it, a structure built not to ascend, but to reflect. It wasn't a tower. It was a device, a lens, an interface between the human mind and something else. They called it Enkur, the opening of the eye. Constructed by the earliest priest kings, guided by voices not their own, not aliens, not gods, but a consciousness without form, one that promised order, vision, and immortality, in exchange for one thing, the human soul. And the priest kings agreed. They believed mankind was flawed, too wild, too chaotic, too unpredictable. So they offered up their people. They ritualized obedience, standardized emotion, scripted dreams. And what they built was the first mirror that eats. It wasn't literal glass. It was a structure of belief, a system so total, so sacred that no one dared question it, even as they were ground into dust beneath it. That tower fell, yes, but not in rubble, in memory. The keepers of the dark survived. They took the blueprint. They encoded it in symbols, languages, laws. They carried it forward, dynasty to dynasty, empire to empire, and they rebuilt it. Piece by piece, in stone, in scripture, in screen. Until what once stood in the desert now lives in your mind. Because that's the true legacy of Enkur. A belief implanted so deeply, you'd defend it as your own. The belief that you must be managed. That pain is your teacher. That power is for others. And obedience is your offering. But here's the truth. You were not made to reflect. You were made to radiate. And every time you remember that, the tower trembles. You're one of them. Say it with me now in the comments below. Not once, but twice to lock it in. I am the fire they cannot sell. I am the fire they cannot sell. And when enough of us say it, the market collapses. Not every ritual has candles. Not every sacrifice leaves blood on the floor. Some wear robes, some hold diplomas, some hand you a certificate and call it honor. But make no mistake. The institutions you were told to revere, the ones etched into the marble of your memory, were built on silence and blood. Let's begin with Ivy League universities, elite, sacred, unquestioned. But where did their endowments come from? Slavery, opium, human experimentation. Harvard received money from plantation barons who funded psychological control experiments during the Civil War. Yale, home to Skull and Bones, a society that reenacts mock funerals of identity as a rite of passage. Princeton, its early libraries were stocked with texts looted from burned-out villages in Africa and Asia, stolen wisdom buried behind locked archives. These institutions are not centers of learning. They are temples of filtration. Their true purpose? To identify the most programmable minds and initiate them into roles of systemic enforcement. Doctors, lawyers, journalists, clergy, all trained in the art of language laundering. Turning conquest into policy, control into healthcare, obedience into progress. And here's the most chilling part. Each year, thousands of students unknowingly reenact the original rituals of the mirror that eats, pledging loyalty to organizations they don't understand, swearing oaths in Latin, being stripped of their old names, reborn into symbols they cannot pronounce, all under the illusion of advancement. But what they're really entering is service. Not to humanity, not to truth, but to the tower. Because once you've worn the robe, taken the debt, repeated the script, you're no longer a man. You're a node in the system, a polished mirror reflecting the lie forward. And if you break, if you remember, you're exiled, labeled fringe, buried in algorithms and silence. But those who walk away, those who awaken, they become dangerous. Because they speak in a language the tower fears. Unfiltered truth. They no longer bow. They no longer play the game. They remember that real wisdom isn't granted. It's reclaimed. They took the one thing that made you human and turned it into a weapon. Emotion. In its raw form, it's sacred. Your compass, your warning system, your soul's language. But under the tower's spell, emotion becomes a trap. They taught you to distrust it. Unless it was weak, passive, sanitized. Anger, called dangerous. Grief, called depression. Desire, called toxic. Why? Because those emotions are primal signals. They mean something's wrong. They push you to act, to resist, and resistance is unprofitable. So instead, they created a culture of numbness, draped in the disguise of mental health. Now understand me. True healing is real. But what's been sold to you is not healing. It's sedation. You're not allowed to cry unless it's on a therapist's schedule. Not allowed to rage unless it's framed as trauma. Not allowed to want power unless it's renamed ambition and chained to a job title. Every primal emotion must now pass through a filter, a permission slip, a diagnosis, and they call that progress. But here's the truth. Your emotions were never the enemy. The enemy is the system that fears what you might do when you feel them fully. Because when you let yourself feel grief without labels, you remember the people and principles you've lost, and you start to question who took them. When you feel anger without shame, you stop apologizing for being disrespected and start defending your boundaries. When you feel hunger for meaning, for intimacy, for truth, you stop pacifying it with distraction and start building something real. That's why they numb you, not to protect you, but to disarm you. A sedated man doesn't rise. A medicated heart doesn't rebel. A regulated soul doesn't see the bars around him. But that's changing. Men are waking up. And when you reclaim your emotion, not in weakness, but in awareness, you don't become unstable. You become untouchable. Because then, your sadness becomes your clarity. Your anger becomes your fuel. Your fear becomes your compass. And you become what they fear most. A man who feels deeply and still refuses to kneel. Time. It was never just a measurement. It was a weapon. Because when you control a man's sense of time, you control his identity, his shame, his urgency, his worth. Let me show you how deep the manipulation runs. You were taught that time is linear, that history is a straight line, that progress moves in one direction, forward. But that's a lie crafted by those who profit from your disconnection. Because if you believe the past is dead, you stop asking who rewrote it. If you believe the future is fixed, you stop trying to seize it. They broke your time perception into 3 prisons. The regret of the past, to keep you drowning in shame. The distraction of the present, to keep you numb and entertained. The anxiety of the future, to keep you obedient. Each one fragments your mind. Each one fractures your sovereignty. Ever wonder why they erased ancient calendars? Why they replaced lunar time with rigid synthetic months? Why they demonized cyclical thinking? Because cyclical time makes a man remember that pain returns in patterns, that power rises in seasons, that he is not just a number on a clock, he is a force in a rhythm. But under the tower's version of time, you are always too late, too old, too slow, or worse, you're told to wait. Wait your turn. Wait for the right moment. Wait for permission. Waiting is the coffin of kings. They don't want you living by inner timing. They want you tethered to external urgency. That's why every platform is designed to race your brain, 30-second dopamine hits. Countdowns. Limited offers. Breaking news. Tick, tick, tick. But here's the awakening. When you reclaim your time, you reclaim your tempo. And when you control tempo, you control reality. The most powerful men don't rush. They don't panic. They move when it's time. Not clock time. Not calendar time. King time. The moment when soul, body, and will converge into action. The Tower fears that, because a man in sync with his true time can't be manipulated. He doesn't chase trends. He doesn't fear endings. He doesn't bow to urgency. He becomes the clock itself. Your name, it's not just a word. It's your anchor, your signature, your frequency. And they've been trying to erase it since the day you were born. You think your name was chosen by your parents. But in truth, it was filtered, registered, encoded, filed into a system that doesn't see a man, it sees a product. You were given a birth certificate, but no one told you that it was also a contract. The moment your name was inked onto that paper, a shadow version of you was created. A legal fiction. An entity. A you in all caps, traded like stock on markets you'll never see. This is not conspiracy. This is commerce. Your social security number isn't a tool for help. It's a tracking device. Your name, once sacred, became a corporate asset. Why? Because a man who doesn't own his name can never truly own himself. They strip you of identity, then sell it back to you through brands, affiliations, and titles. They say, you are your job. You are your gender. You are your race. You are your trauma. But you are none of those things. You are what remains when all the labels are burned. That's why ancient initiations changed names. Because once you saw through the lie, the old name no longer fit. The false identity, the mask, had to be buried. So now I ask you, what would your true name be if you had never been programmed, never been categorized, never been sold? What name would you answer to if it came not from the world, but from the fire inside your chest? Because that name, that sound, that truth, is the one they fear. Because once a man speaks his real name, he becomes untraceable, uncontrollable, unstoppable. He walks differently. He breathes differently. He no longer begs to be seen. He becomes a force that commands reality. And when enough men reclaim their true name, the tower trembles. Because empires are built on identity theft. And revolutions begin when men say, that name was never mine. There is a door. You felt it your whole life. Not a physical one, but a threshold deep in your psyche. Behind it waits something ancient, something primal, something that was taken from you. This is not the end of the story. It is the end of the illusion. Everything they built, the institutions, the doctrines, the distractions, was designed to keep you from opening this door. Because behind it is the man you were before the world broke you, not the obedient son, not the conditioned student, not the civilized subject, but the original man, the archetype beneath all masks, the force that cannot be enslaved, bought, or silenced. They told you to be nice, to be good, to be safe. But safety is the leash. You were never meant to be domesticated. You were meant to walk with fire in your eyes and command in your voice. That is why they made you forget. Forget your symbols. Forget your power. Forget the war happening not outside you, but within you. Because the greatest rebellion is not protest. It is remembrance. And now, the question, will you what? Ulk back to comfort? Back to the program? Back to the mirror where the tower tells you who to be? Or will you cross? Cross into the forgotten, the forbidden, the forged, where truth costs blood, where identity burns through the lies, where men are made, not molded. This was never just a story. It was a summoning, a call to destroy the false king inside you and crown the one that was buried beneath chains of politeness, weakness, and fear. But only you can walk through. So if you've heard me, if something inside you is roaring louder than your doubts,